The High Magistrate raised his staff, and the small bronze bell fixed to its tip rang once, a hard, metallic peal that cut through the chanting. Elise of Saint, Val screamed as two masked attendants shoved her to her knees before the days. Suspicion drove every movement the occult researcher made that night. He did not step forward, he did not call out, but he pressed his palms flat against the cold stone and watched every gesture for meaning. The tribunal began while the candles still burned low. The list of names lay folded in the magistrate's hands, and the ritual seal caught the light in a way that made the researcher note its pattern with the sharpness of someone reading an accusation. In those first moments the problem was clear: these were not ordinary punishments. The order judged under mask and secrecy. The researcher decided to stay and collect proof. He had come to St. Val with a single lantern and a satchel of notes, not to witness a sentence. He set the lantern on a windowsill in a service corridor and watched the entrance to the tribunal from a slit between flagstones. He adjusted his brass spectacles until the gleam did not smear the script he could see from his angle. He smelled wax and iron and the crowd sweat. He thought of his lapel amulet pressed under his coat, the cipher etched there like a private key, and felt a new, specific ache of unease. Someone had used a matching cipher tonight. The chamber smelled of tallow and boiled leather. The High Magistrate's voice, when it rose through the mask's breathing apertures, was low and controlled. Elise of St. Val, the High Magistrate intoned, and the syllables landed as if they were a verdict. Two masked figures pushed Elise's shoulders so she could not straighten. She held her chin tight. Her knuckles whitened around the torn edge of her shawl. The researcher catalogued these facts with the same precision he used on a brittle folio. The mask's filigree, the staff's reliquary cap, the way the magistrate tilted his head before passing judgment. You are accused of carrying a sign that divides the village. The High Magistrate, how do you answer? Elise's voice was thin. I have nothing to hide, she said. I carry bread and mending. We name what must be cleansed. The High Magistrate answered. Suspicions hardened into a plan inside the researcher's head. He needed to see the list. He needed to see the marginal notes. He had come asking whether these night tribunals were law or sacrament. Now the ritual presented a test that smelled of brass and old paper. The opening question, were these punishments civic or sacred, became a pry point for him. He would follow the records. After the tribunal emptied, the chamber remained sticky with spent wax, and the last of the attendants trudged past, with a folded ledger under an attendant's arm. The researcher slipped from his slit and moved through a back corridor where the stone drank sound. He did not run. He walked with instrumented stillness so his boots would not clack. He found the antechamber where robes hung on pegs and a single table still bore candle wax and a torn list pinned with a bone awl. He knelt and pulled the list free with ink, stained fingers. The paper was rough and smelled of resins. A marginal note in a cramped hand used a cipher he recognized from a small amulet that sat against his sternum under his coat. The note was a single line, a two-letter mark and a date, followed by an odd phrase in the local dialect that suggested omen, reading, not simple law. He folded the list into his coat and swallowed his breath. He almost left then. He did not, because a sound reached him, the scrape of a stool, and the whisper of someone kneeling at a wooden desk. He traced the noise to an archive alcove, where a locked chest lay under a tarpaulin. The researcher picked the lock with a bobby pin and a breath of patience. Inside he found a sealed parchment bearing the order's cipher and a dried drop of red wax. He pressed the parchment to his nose. The wax was ironed with smoke. Later, in the damp holding cell, he watched Elise when the door shut behind him. The cell had a single arrow, slotted slit for air, and a cobbled bench. Elise sat with her shoulders inward like a bird. The researcher crouched near enough that she could see the rim of his spectacles. Elise, he said softly, tell me what you carried. She swallowed. A charm, she whispered. A wooden bead my mother gave me. The researcher reached into her sleeve and felt a carved wooden charm warm from her skin. He did not pry at first. He let the action slow. "Show me the charm," he said. She hesitated, then handed it through the bars. Up close, the charm had scratch marks that matched a litany of names he had seen in civic rosters. "Why would a charm have names on it?" he asked. Elise looked at him and then at the floor. "They read the names in a circle," she said. "They speak words that are like a ledger reading." He repeated the phrase physically. "Ledger, names, ceremony." Doubt shifted into alarm. His fingers tightened around the charm. He felt the hairs on his forearm prick. He pointed questions, and Elise answered with small specific details. A red wax seal, a bell struck thrice, the magistrate's masks held high. Each fractional memory pushed the researcher from suspicion to a sharper fear that these were not only punishments, but a method to reorder families. At dawn, before the sky went white, an old man found him in the tavern back room. He called himself Martin and sat with his palms flat on the table. He had once served the order, he said, and his lips shook when he told fragments. "Martin, the researcher, you served them. Tell me how names are chosen." Martin spat into his palm and wiped it on the hem of his sleeve. "They wait for omens by the river, Martin. They rid trampled grasses and the dead fish. They mark families they say carry friction. Why target families?" The researcher. Martin stared at the table. "Because a name scares the village into giving property back or silence." The researcher wrote the word social engineering in his notebook, and then crossed it out. He recorded Martin's details, the omens, the river, the way the magistrates used rumors to tighten control. The old man's testimony reframed the order from holy purge to civic lever. The researcher felt his posture change, curiosity hardening into urgency. Threat arrived soon after. Constable Duper intercepted the researcher outside the archive, blocking the lane with a lantern held high and a scrap of trial list clutched in his hand. He smelled of stale ale and damp wool. "You are meddling in business that keeps the village safe," Duper said. "Put that book away." Why would the order bind itself to civic roles? The researcher. Duper stepped closer. "Because control wears a white mask," he said. "Because certain families must be watched." He pushed the scrap of paper across to the researcher and then hissed, "Leave this alone." They argued in quick, angled lines. Constable Duper, the researcher. "Who watches the watchers?" Duper answered, "The order does." Duper's threat was concrete. He returned a confiscated scrap with a name circled and warned that more prying would draw attention. The researcher folded the scrap into his coat. When Duper left, his lantern swinging, the researcher listened to the way morning birds kept a thin, persistent call and wrote new notes under the light of his own lamp. He decided to break into the reliquary chamber beneath the tribunal. He had smuggled wax for a new seal and a pair of thin gloves. The reliquary door was heavy oak with iron cleats. He pried it with a harnessed crowbar. Nails squealed. He moved like a man counting breaths. Inside, the chamber smelled of dust and musk. Shelves held jars of salts and ledger bindings stacked in rows. Candles were in iron sconces, unlit. On a raised plinth lay the order-bound ledger, its cover stamped with the same filigree he had watched on the High Magistrate's mask. He set his satchel down and eased the ledger open. The pages were dense with names and short annotations. Date rubrics. Each entry had 2 columns, a civic notation, tax arrear, land dispute, and a ritual notation. A cipher mark, a marginal note about omens. As he turned the pages, he felt a breath at his back and a shape pooling in the doorway. "You should not touch that ledger," a voice said through a mask. The researcher spun. The High Magistrate filled the doorway like a dark column. The white porcelain mask caught the stray dawn light leaking through a slit. He recognized the filigree now as not only ceremonial but administrative. The same pattern was stamped at the corner of a municipal charter the researcher had seen weeks earlier. High Magistrate, the researcher, setting the ledger between them upright so the magistrate could see the opened page. "What is the order's claim?" The High Magistrate tilted his head. "We preserve balance," he said. "Balance preserves the peace. These are civic records and ritual marks together." The researcher: "This is not preservation. This is relocation." The magistrate's shoulders did not move. "You speak of relocation as if it were theft," he said. The village called for order. We answered. "Answering does not justify secret lists." The researcher: "Who chooses the names?" The magistrate stepped forward and his staff tapped the floor. He raised the staff so the reliquary's seal glinted and the brass bell sang 3 low notes. "We choose by omen and need," he said. "We choose to maintain what must remain." The researcher turned the ledger and found, with a small, frozen shock, an entry marked with the very cipher that matched his lapel amulet. The entry listed a name in his own circle, a neighbor's wife he had interviewed days earlier, and beside it a short marginal note that echoed a phrase the researcher had once seen in an old parish ledger. To be purified, his chest tightened. He felt his fingers go cold. "Why is my cipher on your list?" The researcher. The High Magistrate's masked face gave nothing, but the tilt of his head was precise. "You have been seen," the magistrate said. "You keep asking where names come from." That attention is a mark, a hard, small panic pressed against the researcher's diaphragm. His thoughts snapped into procedural action. He shoved a folded ledger page into his coat and grabbed a porcelain fragment, white and curved, from a cracked reliquary beside the plinth. He pocketed both before the magistrate could close the door. The escape was a measured series of choices. A back stair that smelled of mold, a passage that sloped under the refectory floor, the muffled tread of boots above. The order scribe, Laurent, a thin man with ink, stained knuckles, tried to bar a side door when the researcher ran into him in a service passage. Laurent, the researcher: "Step aside, you will ruin us all." Laurent: "You will ruin me. Show me a name." Laurent, the researcher: "Show me one proof." Laurent's hands trembled. "I write what I am told," he said. "I write in columns." The researcher pushed past him and turned a corner into a corridor of service stairs and clanging kettles. He slipped through a slit at last and out into the alley where dawn narrowed. Back in his study, the researcher spread the stolen ledger page and the porcelain fragment on a table beneath a candle. He compared the cipher against the amulet under his waistcoat. The marks matched exactly, a chevron within a ring and an extra dot in the lower left. He set the porcelain fragment beside the ledger and saw, sketched lightly in the margin, the same filigree carved into the fragment. He arranged the evidence the way an archivist arranges plates under glass. He read the marginal note aloud to test its weight. "To be purified," he said, and then he stopped because the sound of his voice made the half. Memory of Elise reciting the ritual phrase returned vivid and precise. He imagined the magistrates speaking the names out loud, seeing villagers flinch, seeing ledgers used as instruments to remove people from property or voice. The researcher's suspicion hardened into anger that had weight. He moved with a quieter force now, placing each object into a lined box intended for the scriptorium. He heard a knock on his study door. He froze and listened. The knock came twice more deliberate. He opened a crack and found no one. Only a folded scrap had been slid under the door. He retrieved it with shaking fingers. The scrap held a single line of script. A name circled and a single word beneath it: "Watch." He sat at his table and read the ledger one more time. He traced how civic complaints matched ritual notations. He wrote down names that had shifted property or influence after a tribunal. He mapped the marginalia to municipal decrees and found an ugly pattern. The order used ceremonies to validate legal transfers, not merely to purify souls. He tapped his pen against the page and breathed through a long, slow exhalation. The chapter closed with the researcher assembling proof and realizing the scope of danger. The ledger linked the order's secrecy to civic administration. His own amulet matched a cipher in the margin, and a masked magistrate had watched him take the page. He did not speak of fate, he moved. He boxed the ledger page and the porcelain fragment, set a wax seal of his own across the lid, and placed the box on a shelf beneath a heap of benign parish records. He resolved to follow the ledger's thread into the next court hearing. Outside, at the edge of morning, a single raven landed atop the priory gate and let out a dry croak. The researcher heard the sound as he closed his shutter. Then he turned the key on his study door and touched his lapel amulet. Feeling the cold metal, he had proof he had a threat. When a second knock sounded, this time a firmer rap, the final page shows him standing to open the door. The ledger box still on the table, and the faint imprint of the magistrate's seal pressed into his palms. The occult researcher stopped with his hand on the ledger and stiffened. The wet shine of fresh ink caught the candlelight. Suspicion tightened his throat. This was not routine archival wear. He slipped the candle closer and read the name. Elise of St. Val, and a date written after the tribunal he had seen at the dais. He pressed a fingertip to the margin and left a faint smudge. The ledger smelled of beeswax, old glue, and a faint iron tang that suggested recent handling. He had come for verification. The abbey's sealed archive was a narrow alcove under the choir, a place he used when the monks slept. He had catalogued rotting registers, measured ink fades, and traced scribed hands for a decade. Now the sight of wet strokes made him move faster. Suspicion had guided him into the vault. Suspicion would not let him leave with the ledger unchanged. He fumbled the brass spectacles from his satchel and set them on the bridge of his nose. He read the line again. The handwriting matched the order's script. Compact letters, a certain hooked flourish on the T. He counted the dates, one entry, then a gap, then another inked name with a seal. The seal's impression was partial, a crescent with a tiny cipher mark he did not yet recognize. A sound at the archive mouth made him flatten against the stone. Someone carried a tray past the threshold. A muffled shuffle, a whispered exchange, the scrape of leather. He drew the satchel over the ledger and pulled an old robe over his shoulders. He had no plan for confrontation. Doubt prickled. If someone had written Elise's name after the tribunal, then either the order had returned to its rounds, or someone within the abbey remained its hand. He stepped out into the corridor and found the archivist bent over a table, fanning loose lists like a midwife with newly birthed sheets. The archivist's hair was cropped close, hands stained with ink, and his shoulders carried the quick tremor of a man who had been hiding heat beneath a cloak. "You should not be here, the archivist. Why is Elise's name here?" The researcher, and he kept his voice low, measured. Suspicion governed the question. He named the ledger and held the open page under the candle. The archivist swallowed. "I wrote it down. They came with orders. The list must be extended. I only wrote what I was given." He slid his gaze to the corridor. More names. "From villages I do not know. Who came?" The researcher leaned forward until the seam of their coats nearly met. The archivist's fingers drifted to the satchel on his belt. "Masked men. Not the magistrate tonight. They left a reliquary. They for secrecy. They threatened." Who threatened you? Say a name." The researcher demanded. The archivist hesitated. He had the look of a man balancing a ledger in his hands and a life in his teeth. "They called themselves the Order's couriers." A voice said the High Magistrate commanded it. He did not say the High Magistrate raised his staff and rang the bronze bell. But the researcher felt the memory of that night, as if the bell had sounded again. The metallic peal that had cut the chanting and sent Elise screaming. At that reference, the researcher tightened his grip on the ledger. Doubt shifted into fear. He had already watched Elise shoved to her knees, had seen the magistrate's porcelain mask gleam under candlelight. If the order's lists moved beyond the abbey, then parishes beyond St. Vol were at risk. "Bring me the fresh lists." The researcher, "Bring the satchel." "If you lied, I'll know it from the scratches on the seals." The archivist hesitated, then produced a satchel from beneath the table. He flung it toward the researcher with a clumsy motion, and then turned his face to the wall. "I am tired of being careful." The archivist. They stood over my shoulder and whispered the names in my ear. I signed letters I did not read. They spread the lists across the table. Ink still blood interlaid paper. Names, parish notations, brief seals. The researcher traced a line with the tip of his finger. Many names matched households the researcher had cross-referenced in his notes. Others belonged to districts farther north. They are coordinating, he murmured. This is not just St. Val. An acute sound cut across the archive. The quick knock of a cane at the abbey stairwell. Voices argued in the corridor. 2 monks and a distant caller. The archivist flinched and shoved a bundle into a small chest. Outside the abbey, a different scene unspooled. The researcher left that night for St. Val and found the village near dawn. Smoke rose from chimneys like short prayers. Eliz's brother, Henry, met him at the square with a lantern and a face that had gone hollow. The village elder, named Maud, waited by the well, her palms rough and knuckled. Is she here? Henry immediately. No, the researcher. He set the ledger on the cart beside them and tapped the page where Elise's name was written. She was listed again in the ledger. Henry's jaw worked. They took 2 names last week. A shepherd and a widow. The widow's boy left the next morning with a mark on his cloak. They leave no banner, only this quiet. Maud, what do you know? Maud's eyes did not leave the ground. She cupped the lantern flame as if it were a stolen coin. People wake to empty beds. Sometimes a shoe remains, sometimes a scorch on the hearthstone. We find marks on doors in the morning, no touch, no sign of forced entry. They do not take at noon. They come at night. Her voice stopped short on the last sentence. She breathed shallowly, counting what she would have to lose. Who? The researcher. No one speaks names in St. Val, Maud, but they say the High Magistrate wants purity. He sits behind the mask and lets attendants move his will. Henry spat. He sat on the dais. I saw it. I saw Elise thrown down and her shawl torn. The magistrate, what did he judge? A purity and sin are words that mean different things when a mask decides them. The researcher. He folded the ledger and put it under his coat. We will search the cottages. I will not leave until I know where she went. They split in pairs. The researcher moved house to house while Maud and Henry checked the yards and barns. He examined doorframes for scratches, looked for telltale ash on thresholds, and hissed questions at neighbors who stared with tired eyes. In one loft he found a thread of white cloth caught on a nail, the same weave as the tiny tattered shawl Elise wore. That discovery felt like a hand in a dark pocket, small and certain. An external event followed. A child at the edge of the lane cried out and pointed to a road footprint leading from the abbey, not from the village. The researcher followed the track, mud impressed where boots had pressed. He traced the path until it led under a copse of hawthorn. The sun threatened the horizon. He crouched and found a torn margin of paper snagged on a root. The paper bore a cipher mark he had seen faintly in the ledger seal. He held it up against the light. The ink had bled into the fibers. Someone had torn the folio in a hurry. At that moment, a distant wagon rattled. The researcher ducked behind Thorn. 2 masked attendants rode past on foot, carrying a sealed folio wrapped in oilcloth. They spoke no names. The researcher watched them move with practiced silence. His body shifted from study to pursuit. He waited until they passed, then rose and pursued at a cautious distance. They took a muddy lane toward the abbey. The researcher tried to intercept with Henry and 2 villagers who had followed. They planned an ambush. He caught Henry's eye and nodded once. Wait, he mouthed. They crouched behind a stack of carts. The ambush began clumsily. A villager stepped on a loose board and gave a small cough. One attendant turned and raised his lantern. The researcher went forward, grabbed at the folio. The attendants pushed back. A tussle broke out. Henry grabbed a wrist. The folio slipped free. A masked courier caught it and ran. The road became a blur of arms and leather. In the scramble, a piece of the folio's margin tore and fluttered into the mud. They chased. The researcher reached the abbey gate as the courier slipped through a side door. The researcher slammed into a stone buttress and watched the courier disappear. Around him, villagers pressed their hands to their mouths. Enri's knuckles were white where he gripped the handle of his knife. They had failed. The folio was gone. The torn margin, however, had a small inked cipher identical to the cipher on the amulet pinned to the researcher's lapel. He had worn that amulet for years. He had not realized the exact carving on its face. He lifted the torn margin and compared the mark to his own ring of brass. The pattern matched. 3 notches, a smaller crescent, and a tiny dot in the lower quadrant. The match hit him like a blow. Betrayal surged through his chest. He thought of late nights in the abbey, the confidences he had traded for access, the small favors he had accepted. He had never imagined his own cipher would appear on a page that condemned a woman he had come to feel responsible for. Doubt that had pushed him into the archives turned toward himself. He examined the amulet under a stray shard of sunlight in the ruined chapel. The insignia was faint where sweat had worn the brass. He pressed a fingertip into the tiny dot and tasted salt. This was no random cipher. Someone close to his world, someone with access to both the order's seals and his personal cipher, had a hand in feeding the ledger. Thrown into that revelation, he met 2 practical choices at once. Confront the archivist and risk exposing Henry and the villagers, or follow the courier's path deeper into the abbey's restricted wings and risk walking into the High Magistrate's circle. He did both. He took the torn margin and the amulet to the archivist and demanded answers. The archivist looked at the mark and then at the amulet and paled. I swore not to speak. The archivist. But they watch us. They watch even those who sought the pages. I made copies. I hid names. If they knew, his voice stopped. He thrust a folded list into the researcher's hands. Take them. Burn them if you must. Take them and go before they notice. Who gave you that amulet? The researcher. The archivist shifted his weight from one foot to the other. No one gave me anything. I've seen men with that mark on their seals. But I cannot say more. The researcher left with the lists and a new, colder suspicion. He moved toward the ruined chapel, where the High Magistrate held the last judgment. He found the doorway open. A shaft of noon light cut through fissures in the roof and painted the dais in a strip of brightness. The High Magistrate stood at the center, a tall figure, porcelain mask catching light. 2 masked attendants flanked him. The ritual staff he had seen before leaned heavy against the dais. The reliquary sat within a case. You should not be here. The High Magistrate. His voice came muffled through the mask and sounded like wind through a closed pipe. Why is Elise listed again? The researcher. He kept his hands visible. Doubt had become accusation in his tone. The ledger records what must be recorded. The magistrate, purity is a matter beyond simple mercy. Who signs these names? Who gave the orders? The researcher demanded. He stepped forward until the hem of his coat brushed the dais. The magistrate tipped his head. 2 attendants moved forward and seized the researcher's satchel. The reliquary clicked as it opened. A sealed folio lay inside, bound in wax and stamped with the same crescent mark. The magistrate lifted it and let it rest across the palm of his robe. You searched the archive, the magistrate. You found what was not meant for you. You follow footprints. You come armed with anger and questions. Elise is from St. Vaul. The researcher. She is registered here again after your tribunal. You permitted this. A pause. The researcher felt the air in the chapel press against his chest. He forced himself to breathe and to hold the ledger in both hands like an argument. Elise's fate was settled by the right, the magistrate. But the order's work is not only one sitting. Names are tested, names are retested. A folio moves and the list expands. That is all. Who placed my cipher on the margin? The researcher, whose hand knows my amulet's cut. The magistrate did not answer. He tilted his head and gestured with the reliquary toward a sealed envelope tucked beneath his robes. The attendant produced a thin paper and set it on the dais. The researcher recognized the archivist's hand in one corner. He lifted it and read a single line. A name crossed out, a different parish inked in, and then his own amulet's cipher pressed as a note. The researcher stepped back and the chamber swam for a heartbeat. He felt the betrayal not as a statement but as a physical strike. The archivist had been forced. The order had been inside his circles. His choices narrowed. We will not finish this as a verbal contest. The researcher. He lowered his voice. Let me see the list of names you will enact tomorrow. Let me see the wards you plan to traverse. If you will not, then I will leave with the archivist's copies and take them to the parishes. You would bring the order into the open. The magistrate. The tone was calm. The mask's eye slits seemed to narrow. I would bring a sheet of paper to people who have lost kin. The researcher. I will show them what you signed. I will let them say whether you have judged rightly. The magistrate remained unmoved. Then, in a motion that cut like a guillotine, he lifted his staff and tapped it once on the dais. A soft bell in the staff chimed. The attendant stepped forward and took the researcher by the shoulders. One private judgment. The magistrate you may witness, and then you may leave. If you speak of this, you will force a punishment that will fall upon those who sent you into my ways. The researcher felt a surge of resolve tighten his chest. He thought of Elise kneeling, of Henry's hand, of Maud's lantern. He also felt a cold nausea at the evidence that a cipher he had worn for years now marked her condemnation. He could not leave without seeing the folio opened. He nodded. The attendants forced him to sit on a low stool before the dais. The reliquary was set between them. The magistrate peeled back wax and revealed a list. The researcher peered. Names ran down the page. Many he knew. Elise's name was at the top, marked in a different ink with a note that read, "Pending verification, attendant to deliver." He traced the line with his finger and felt the ridged impression of the cipher. The magistrate tilted his head and spoke as if delivering a lesson rather than a verdict. The order judges not from whim. We act to correct what corrodes the body of the parish. What corroded Saint Val? The researcher. What test did Elise fail? Fear appears more often in wards than virtue does. The magistrate. We remove those whose presence inflames discord. Then bring me the witnesses. The researcher. Bring me the charges. Let Elise hear them. He kept his voice tight. For a moment the magistrate's hands trembled beneath his robe. He did not speak. One attendant crossed the chapel and returned with a small book of minutes. The researcher read it. The entries were concise, allegations brief notes, the magistrate's shorthand. One line caught him, a notation that a courier had been placed to reinforce selection. Another line bore his cipher, not as a mark of consent but as a delivery token. He realized then that the order had used his name as a routing mark. Someone had thought to mask their distribution by imprinting it with a cipher associated with him. Whether that had been to deceive those who would open the folios, or to implicate him if the folio were exposed, he could not know. The researcher looked up. "Who among you uses my cipher?" He asked. "Who knew to press my mark into your margins?" The magistrate made no answer. He closed the minutes and replaced the reliquary under its lid. The attendants rose and moved to the chapel doors. The researcher felt the hinge of events close but did not yet know which way the bolt turned. Outside the chapel, the sun had moved. Villagers had gathered, pulled by rumor, by fear, and by the researcher's steps. Henry stood with Maud and two other men. Their faces were raw. When the researcher emerged with the seized minutes and the archivist's smuggled lists, they crowded around him. "What did you learn?" "Henry, they are coordinating rounds across parishes tomorrow night." The researcher. He spread the lists on a flat stone. "They will move by coach and by foot. The folios move with them. They use couriers. They mark lists with a cipher to route them." "My cipher was used to mark one margin." Henry's face turned ashen. Maud muttered a prayer and then squared her shoulders. "Then we move tonight," she said. Her voice, which had been quiet in the square and uncertain by the hearth, tightened into action. "We cannot fight them in force." "Henry, we will be slaughtered." "We can stop a courier," the researcher answered. "We can intercept a folio and copy the names. If we cannot keep them from taking Alice, we can at least break their chain," they argued in sharp, rapid lines. Henry urged caution. Maud insisted on haste. The researcher directed their motions. They planned where to hide, how to signal, how to move quietly along the lane. Each instruction was a small decision that rearranged their risk. The night came quick. They waited by the hawthorn. Rain thinned to a mist. The courier's lantern bobbed. The researcher crept forward and grabbed the courier's sleeve. This time the struggle was brief. A folio slid free. They dragged it into the bushes and opened it under a droplet of rain. Names spilled across the page in quick strokes. The researcher copied them into his own book with a steady hand. Aliz's name was first. Beside it, someone had written a short phrase in tiny script. "Final pass." The researcher felt the knot of dread loosen into a blade of resolve. He had what he needed to warn the villagers and to demonstrate the order's reach. He also had the torn margin and the amulet. He would need to learn who had pressed his cipher into the folio and why. He had to know whether the mark was a frame or a misapplied routing stamp. They retreated to the chapel ruin where the researcher counted names by candlelight while villagers whispered. Maud read the roster aloud. Henry checked fields and farms. Each new name shifted their plan and tightened the circle around the coming night tribunals. The researcher marked parishes and routes on a rough map. He drew lines with a blunt quill until his finger bled faintly. At dawn, the researcher packed the copied lists and a folded, torn margin into his satchel. He pressed the brass amulet into his palm and felt the tiny chip of brass that matched the cipher. He thought of a long arc of nights spent in archives and of a single choice to accept a favor that now looked like complicity. He considered the archivist's plea and the high magistrate's sealed calm. He had shifted through suspicion, fear, and into a brittle clarity. He had moved from doubt about the ledger to the knowledge that the order reached into the abbey's rooms and the village's beds. He had seen Henry's anger and Maud's resolve turn into coordinated action. He had forced the magistrate to reveal the minutes, and those minutes had changed his understanding of the order's logistics. Before he left the ruined chapel, the researcher turned the torn margin over again. The cipher printed on the paper matched the amulet. He folded the margin carefully and slid it into his satchel. The archivist's copies sat beside him, stacked like an indictment. He thrust the lists into his jacket, then paused at the threshold. He listened. A step sounded on the chapel threshold. Heavy, deliberate. He looked up and saw a figure standing in the doorway, hood dark, face hidden. The visitor's foot tapped once on the stone. The researcher tightened his grip on the satchel and did not speak. The figure did not move forward. The chapter closed on that single, concrete sound, the heavy step that answered no question and demanded another. He forced the stone lid aside and a hooded hand slammed the ledger closed over the fresh ink. Suspicion hardened in him like frost. The occult researcher pressed his palm to the chest and heard a second hand shut the book as if to hide a wound. He had risked everything to see that page. Within 5 breaths he understood the stakes. The ledger named Alice of Saint, Val with a new verdict and a date that had not existed when he watched the tribunal weeks earlier. Suspicion drove him down the corridor on silent feet. He kept his body low beneath the vaulted reliquary ceiling. He smelled beeswax and old mortar. His lamp cast a narrow circle. Outside its stone joints stepped away into black. He had felt guilty before, an ache of responsibility, but suspicion now directed his hands. He slid the ledger from the chest and held it until a thread of cold sweat ran down his back. A noise startled him, a boot against flagstone. He smuggled the ledger back into the chest and let the lid fall. He froze and listened. Footsteps moved away. He had come because of the bell at the tribunal, because Alice had screamed and a bronze peal had cut the chanting, because the ledger's new ink in the town archive had matched what he had seen. Those exact memories pushed him through this night. He left the reliquary the way he had entered, by a narrow service stair. The corridor outside smelled of smoke and wet wool. He caught a glimpse of a hooded attendant at the bend and slid behind a column. The attendant turned, pale face concealed by shadow, and passed. The researcher breathed again and moved, because fear arrived with the footfall. Fear tightened his chest and drove him faster. His pace changed from precise to urgent. He did not make it far. A masked attendant blocked the stairhead, step and shadow and the scrape of leather. The attendant reached for him. The researcher pushed past, and the attendant swung a wooden staff. The two collided in a brief, physical shout, "Stop!" The attendant barked, "I am not yours," the researcher said, voice low and steady, and felt his shoulder smart where the staff hit. He drove his shoulder into the attendant's ribs and slipped by. The corridor rang with the sound of a heavy oak door slamming shut as the attendant hammered it behind him. The slam turned private theft into open chase. He ran to the village edge and burst into the peasant cottage panting. Elise crouched in a corner, shawl pulled tight, eyes wide and raw. The village elder stood in the doorway like an accusation. "Elise," the researcher said, "they have written you again." The ledger. Elise stared at the floor and pressed her palms to the seams of her sleeves. "I thought it had stopped," she said. Voice too small to carry. "They came in the night and took a name. I woke and the bell had not yet rung. The village elder, a short man named Jolan, whose throat held the rasp of a life outdoors, slammed his palm on the table. "You took a risk, researcher. You brought it to me, but you should have left the ledger sealed. The order watches for hands in the archive. They watch every pocket." Conversation hardened into strategy. The researcher placed the torn ledger fragment on the hearth and set a single candle beside it. The fresh ink showed the same handwriting he had traced earlier in the chapel, but a new column had been added, a small seal pressed into wax. He slid a finger to test it. "This signet," the researcher said. "It matches the cipher on my lapel amulet." He did not say the words as accusation. He them as discovery. His hands trembled only slightly. Jolan's face went flat. "You mean to tell me the order stamped your seal? Either someone is framing me, or I have been manipulated into carrying their cipher into their own ledger. I do not yet know which." Elise looked at his hands. "They called me by the old name. They called me witch." That line moved the conversation. Fear shifted into anger in the researcher. Anger sharpened his reasoning. He remembered the bronze bell and the high magistrate's slow tilt of the head on the dais. He remembered the ledger as new ink catching candlelight in the town chest. He had seen names appear after verdicts, not before. If they can write verdicts after the fact, then truth is a page they can fold over a life, he said. They can make a man or woman guilty by ink and seal. Jolan spat once and then nodded. Then we force the ledger into light. We break their anonymity. We demand a reading. The researcher felt a new clarity. He made choices with the speed of someone who had had time to weigh consequences and now acted. The plan was simple. March to the chapel at dusk, present the forged ledger, demand that the magistrates read the entries aloud before the attendants and villagers, and expose the seal. If the signet had been applied by order hands, then they would need to justify it. If it had been forged, then the public reading would show the forgery. They moved as dusk took shape. Jolan fetched a battered pitchfork and a half cape. Elise wrapped her shawl thicker and steadied her breath. The researcher set his old leather satchel over his shoulder and picked up his brass spectacles. Each item felt like a promise. On the walk to the chapel, rumors trailed them. A woman whispered that a child had been taken by masked men the week prior. A smith muttered his concern about the magistrate's sealed orders. Every passing face turned away. The researcher catalogued these in silence. Suspicion had become shared unease. The shift from private doubt to communal worry changed the stakes. It made their action necessary. They reached the chapel and took their place among the villagers. Candles gleamed on iron sconces. The High Magistrate rose from the dais and lowered his white porcelain mask in the same slow ritual the researcher had seen before. The magistrate's voice came muffled through the mask when he spoke. "Bring forward the ledger," he intoned. The researcher stepped to the front and slammed the torn ledger fragment onto the dais. The fragment fluttered under the candle drafts like a bird with a broken wing. "You sit and you read it," the researcher said. "Read these entries." Read the date and the seal. "The people should hear your hand speak for itself." A ripple of sound moved through the attendants. A masked attendant reached for Elise and began to pull her toward the dais. Hands collided in the eisel. The village elder shoved the attendant away and the crowd surged. The researcher heard Elise's nails scrape a floorboard. "Let the records speak." Jolan shouted, "You have no right." The High Magistrate began. His tone held the same controlled coldness as before. "You have the right to your robes." "We have the right to sight," the researcher said. "Read it now." The magistrate pressed his palms to the ledger as if to steady it, and then to the fragments. He spoke the name aloud. "Elise of St. Vaul," the voice of the High Magistrate carried, cracked by resonance of the mask. The researcher watched the magistrate's hand hover above the page. He expected denial or a claim of forgery. Instead, what slid from the magistrate's mouth was a ritual turn, the intonation of a verdict spoken as if by tradition. "This name is placed and confirmed," the magistrate said. The crowd stiffened. The researcher felt the air leave the room, as if someone had drawn a cloth across the bellows. Rapidly, the magistrate's attendants surged forward. One seized Elise's shoulder and another clapped a cuff on her wrists. The researcher lunged for her. "Let go!" He yelled, "Silence!" The High Magistrate commanded through the mask. 3 rapid exchanges followed between the researcher and the attendants. The researcher demanded that they release Elise. The attendants replied with the ritual phrases of authority and pressed their palms against the page as if to burn it into the air. "You cannot do this in secret." The researcher said, "Either you show the instrument that made this mark, or you admit you forge names." The High Magistrate tilted his head. The attendants pushed Elise forward to the dais and bound her knees with a coarse rope. She gasped. An attendant ripped a hidden parchment free from within the ledger. He unfurled it and brandished a small wax seal stamped with the order's cipher. The seal gleamed under candlelight. The researcher reached for it. A masked hand intercepted his reach and struck him across the jaw. Pain exploded, and a taste of iron filled his mouth. He caught the edge of the dais as his knees buckled. While he staggered, a sudden commotion came from the back. A faction of villagers surged into the chapel, led by a miller named Corin and another woman, Emery Orb, whom the researcher had seen at the village well. Their faces were plain, their hands empty but for grit and resolve. "You will not take her," Corin shouted. "You have no claim over our homes with stolen ink." Emery Orb. The confrontation escalated. Jolan shoved an attendant. Another attendant drew a dagger. The researcher lurched to his feet and pushed through the press. He grabbed the wax seal from the attendant's fingers and held it up for the crowd. "Look at the ring," the researcher said, voice hoarse. "See the impression. This ring matches my amulet." Someone in the crowd cried that the researcher had been the magistrate's spy. Another voice said the magistrate had framed him. The High Magistrate's composure split into an immediate, precise fury. He raised his staff and struck the stone floor. The sound cut like a blade. The magistrate's attendants moved like a single machine. They seized Elise and dragged her toward the dais again. A woman in the 3rd row bolted for the doors. The researcher pushed through to grab Elise's sleeve and was met by the magistrate's staff across his ribs. He fell and saw black spots at the edges of his vision. He tasted blood. The world tightened to the metallic tang on his tongue. The crowd at the chapel's edges began to divide. Some shouted for the order. Some shouted for release. This fracture in authority was immediate. The magistrate stepped back and let the attendants do his work. Then, without warning, masked hands lifted Elise and carried her out a side door where torchlight met the dawn. No one followed them for a breath. The researcher stumbled outside as villagers pushed after the retreating procession. The magistrate had not fled. He remained on the dais, masked perfect and white, while his attendants moved like a single, obedient shadow. For a moment the researcher feared he had failed. Fear folded to exhaustion, he rose and watched a group of attendants load a cart with a closed trunk. The trunk might hold evidence or might conceal a prisoner. Jolan took a long step and placed his fist against the side of an attendant. "You will tell us where she goes, Jolan." The attendant spat and gave only a curt, ritual answer that meant nothing to a man without the order's codes. The crowd edged closer. Voices rose into a chorus. The magistrate lifted a hand and spoke the order's formal words. The bells in the chapel chimed once, soft, metallic, the same sound the researcher remembered from the night tribunal. A small group of villagers surged forward and seized the cart's reins. In the scramble, a belt pouch fell and spilled salt and a small sealed scroll onto the ground. The researcher kicked the scroll under the cart's wheel and slid his hand over it. He could not read in the dark, but he could feel heavy parchment and pressed wax. He pried it free and opened it with 2 fingers. Inside was a list of names and dates, and a single notation written in a tight, careful hand that matched the ledger as new ink. At the bottom was a line that made his stomach drop. His own cipher, inked next to a name he did not recognize. He had been turned into an instrument of the order. That revelation hit like a second blow. Anger rose in him again, but this time it was different. The sequence moved from suspicion to fear, then fear to anger, then anger to an iron resolve. He could feel the shifts in his jaw, in the way his hands clenched. He breathed once and set his jaw. "We must follow them," he said. "We must know where they take her and why they used my seal." Corin and Emryorb volunteered. They had faces husked by work and suspicion. They climbed onto the cart and forced the driver into motion. The researcher took the tucked scroll and wrapped it into his coat. He kept the wax seal in his other hand. They trailed the magistrate's procession to the river crossing, and then to a ruined priory where moss had eaten the stones. At the priory, masked men clustered like wasps. The magistrate's attendants exchanged silent signals. The researcher and his small group watched from a low hedge. Elise was not visible yet. Jolan whispered, "We cannot charge them openly. They outnumber us and wear the mask. Then we take a page from their own practice," the researcher said. "We force a public account. We make the ledger public. They moved at dawn, not in mobs, but in a line." The researcher had written a public warrant in his own hand, calling for a full reading before the village and an account for any entry with the order's cipher. He intended to place that warrant in the reliquary ledger itself. They found the reliquary chest as the priory's first light broke. A pair of attendants kept watch. Corin threw a small stone to the far side wall. The attendants turned. Emryorb grabbed Elise's arm in that moment and pulled her into a shadowed alcove where she had hidden. Elise's eyes were wet and raw but alive. "They brought me here to watch me break." Elise, once Emryorb had steadied her, I would be an example. "You will not be an example for them," the researcher said. He felt the weight of his failures in his mouth. "You will be a truth they cannot erase." He opened the chest and found the ledger. He peeled back the cloth and read aloud the new entry. The ink matched his amulet's cipher. He traced the line with a forefinger. He felt the wax ridge where the signet had pressed. He knew then that the order had been able to manufacture judgment within their own archive and then use that instrument to intimidate the town. The researcher heard footsteps. He turned. An attendant seized his arm and twisted. Pain stabbed the crease of his elbow. The attendant yanked him back. The researcher grabbed the attendant's wrist, broke the hold, and knocked the man backwards into a low bench. A sequence of 3 exchanges followed. A push, a shove, a shouted command. The researcher and his allies had the momentum. They did not have the numbers for a long fight. They had surprise and the people's attention. Corin beat a drum on the side of the cart until sound thumped like a summons. Villagers came, blacksmith, miller, herb, woman. They formed a loose ring around the priory yard, read the ledger here. The researcher called, read these entries for all to hear. If you claim tradition, show us the tradition. If you claim authority, show us its source. The high magistrate stepped forward, mask gleaming. He carried the ritual staff and the sealed reliquary. He set the staff down and pressed his palms on the ledger as if to steady it. He opened his mouth, and for a long moment there was silence. Then he did something the researcher had not expected. He rolled back the mask. The white porcelain lifted clear of the face, and beneath it was a man whose jaw was narrow and whose eyes were small and cold but unmistakable. The mask had hidden him. Without it he was only a man. The villagers gasped. Elise pushed herself up from the shadow and gripped Rob's sleeve. The researcher felt a sudden shift in the crowd's composition. Faces that had been fearful now hardened into clarity. The magistrate's control had depended on the mask as a symbol of sacred distance. Removing it dissolved the symbol. You knew the ledger was being altered. The researcher said directly, "You knew who put names in ink. You used false seals and the people's fear. Who orders this?" The magistrate's eyes flicked to the researcher and then to the villagers. He spoke without his mask, and the words were thin and practiced. "You do not understand the weight of order," he said. "We hold a balance. We remove contagion. We preserve the whole. You remove people under the guise of purity and call it balance. Corin, you poison homes with lists." The magistrate's face betrayed a flicker, an annoyance that became a tight, mechanical smile. "Do you demand names?" he asked. "I demand every ledger be read before the people, and every seal examined openly," the researcher said. "We will know if you are judges or forgers." The magistrate's attendance shifted. He lowered his voice. "You will bring disorder," he said. "We will bring sight," the researcher said. 3 rapid lines of dialogue passed between the magistrate, Jolan, and Rob. Each sharpened the terms: reading or suppression, exposure or ritual secrecy. The magistrate's calm broke into a thin edginess. In a final maneuver, he stepped away from the reliquary and reached for his staff. In that motion, a woman in the crowd lunged and snatched a corner of the ledger. She pulled and the book tore further. Pages scattered, the seals rolled free and clattered on flagstone. The villagers scooped them up and held them like evidence. The magistrate's response was instant and physical. He advanced on the woman and tried to reclaim the book with a firm hand. A fist met his shoulder. A woman slammed the staff into the stone and the staff cracked at the base. The attendants hesitated. That hesitation turned into a fracture. A handful of attendants dropped their masks and fled into the priory's ruin. Others looked at one another and then down at their hands. The ritual apparatus lost its invincibility. The researcher had not expected all of this to fall away so quickly. Panic and relief collided in the yard. Some villagers shouted for the magistrate to be bound. Others warned caution. The researcher felt every muscle in his shoulders loosen and then retighten as he made a decision. He wrote with a piece of charcoal on a fresh page. His account of the night's events, the list of forged entries, the wax impressions, the names of attendants who had removed their masks, and his own recognition that his amulet had been used as a tool of manipulation. He folded the page and sealed it under a heavy stone within the reliquary chest. "This ledger will be read aloud in the market at midday," he said. "All names and all seals will be shown. We will put the record in the open." The high magistrate staggered back as if struck. He tried to gather his robes and regain a performance. In the end, his grip on the order depended on symbols, and once the symbols cracked, his authority receded. Elise, blood still drying at the corner of a torn sleeve, stepped forward. Her hands trembled. She faced the magistrate and did not look away. "You called me witch," she said. I burned offerings to spirits. You took my neighbor's son and my neighbor's cow. For what? So you could keep your seals. Her voice lacked the trembling she had had in the cottage. It carried instead a raw insistence. The magistrate searched the crowd for a friendly face. One of his attendants who had remained loyal raised a hand and said the order's phrases. The words fell flat. The miller, Corin, barked a single gesture, and a group of villagers came forward and seized the magistrate's staff. The researcher grabbed the staff, and with 2 men they broke it and thrust the pieces into the hearth. The magistrate's lips compressed. By midday, the reliquary chest sat open in the market square. The researcher read aloud the ledger entries, naming dates and seals and the men who had been seen removing masks. Each red name was met with murmurs, then anger, then a demand for accountability. Jolan Emriob catalogued testimony. Corin and several others kept watch for any masked return. The final act arrived later that day. The villagers convened a makeshift council and voted. The magistrate stood before them without his mask. He could not press the staff into the floor and project ritual authority. He could only answer questions. The researcher presented the sealed scroll from the cart, the wax impressions, and his own admission that his amulet had been used. "You chose to use my seal." The researcher said why. The magistrate's answer was a string of rehearsed words about heritage and balance. When for names, he supplied only a few and then fell silent. The villagers demanded more. He could not produce the names of the men who had directed ledger entries. His rhythm of control failed. By dusk, the magistrate was stripped of formal claim. The attendants who had stayed were turned over to a local inquiry. The ones who fled were pursued and captured within 2 days. The Ordis network in the valley collapsed into a handful of men with clipped coats. Elise was not fully free. She bore the marks of her night on the days, bruises and a cord-shaped scar around her wrists. But she slept in her own cottage that night. The villagers placed a watch at her door. They escorted her to the market the next morning and apologized in blunt human ways. Bread, a bit of oil, a hoof of meat for the winter. These were not declarations of absolution. They were acts practical and specific. The researcher gave his ledger entry to Jolan and Memem Rawob and asked that they keep it in the chapel's chest under the watch of the village. He kept a copy wrapped in oilcloth and placed it in his satchel. He had learned that exposure alone did not heal. It only forced tools to change. He had also found the other truth. Some of the Order's power came not from secrecy alone, but from a network of complicity that would not disappear with one public reading. Men in distant houses had acted for protection or for small gains. The ledger's new ink had been a mechanism, but the mechanism had relied on hungry human hands. He recorded the names of those who had aided the magistrate and those who had resisted. He spoke with the miller and arranged that the magistrate would be escorted to a formal hearing in the county seat, where the provincial judge would listen and where the broken staff could be presented as evidence. The researcher did not relish public ceremonies, but he understood them. He understood that the ritual of law could be repurposed into a tool of disclosure. 2 weeks later, 6 men who had been attendants answered to charges. 4 were imprisoned. 2 turned state's evidence and revealed how the ink had been made to mimic official handwriting and how a traveling seal cutter had been paid to press impressions into wax. The man who had pressed the researcher's cipher into wax admitted he had done so at the magistrate's order because he had been promised safety for his family. The researcher read those testimonies in the daylight of the court chamber. He watched faces shift as men gave small confessions. He watched Elise sit with her hands folded and listen. When the provincial judge asked her whether she wanted to press charges, she said she wanted restitution and the right to live without men arriving at night. The judge obliged as best he could. The order did not vanish overnight. The high magistrate vanished from public life and was placed under house arrest pending further questioning. His mask was locked away in the chapel vault. Men who had feigned ritual piety lost lands they had quietly controlled. A handful of villagers who had once been complicit admitted their roles and paid fines or harsher penalties. The researcher sat in the chapel at dawn and opened the reliquary chest. He withdrew the ledger and turned to the new page he had written on the night of the reading. He read his own lines aloud once to the empty stone, as a ritual of witness. "I write to record what I did and what I failed to see." He said aloud, "I write this so that future hands cannot claim oblivion." He sealed the page beneath stone. He left a single instruction with Jolan. Any further ledger entries must be signed in 3 hands and read in market assembly within 24 hours. Jolan agreed and took the obligation with a grave nod. Elise came to the chapel that afternoon and stayed in the rear pew. She watched the researcher in a way he had not expected. There was no gratitude like a medal, only something quieter, an acceptance that the ledger's exposure had changed the town enough to let her breathe. "I cannot forget what happened," she said once, fingers tight around her shawl. "But I can live where I can lock my door without fear they will write me a new name." The researcher reached across the pew and pressed her hand for a moment. He did not promise peace. He promised only to keep the ledger and to watch. At the reliquary chest that night he wrote a final entry longer than the others. He listed names, times, and the precise sequence of events. He described the bell at the night tribunal, the fresh ink in the archive, the staff astrike on the dais, and the wax impression that had matched his amulet. He recorded conversations, the sound of the oak door slamming, Jolan's first shout, Corin's drum, Emery Orb's lunge for the ledger, and the magistrate's unmasking. He folded the page, pressed wax with his own solidar signet, and sealed the ledger. He slid it into the chest and pushed the stone lid back into place. His hand lingered on the lid for a moment. The reliquary would not hide truth now. It would preserve it for scrutiny. He walked out of the chapel and saw Elise at the market buying a small ribbon with money left by Jolan and others. She tied it into her hair with hands that did not tremble as much. The researcher paused and watched her leave with Corin and Emery Orb. The ledger remained in the chest beneath the chapel. The Order S formal apparatus was broken in the valley. The researcher would continue to cross roads and call witnesses and press for the names that had been hidden. He would also go back to the archive and catalogue the other ledgers. He would not rest entirely. Suspicion would remain, now sharpened into vigilance and method. When he closed the chapel doors that night, the reliquary chest sat heavy and certain under its stone. The researcher had done what he could. He had exposed the instrument, broken the staff, unmasked the magistrate, and set procedures in place to prevent the ledger's misuse again. Elise had her home. The villagers had reclaimed a portion of self-governance. The high magistrate had lost his public claim. He set his satchel on the bench, took off his spectacles, and inspected his amulet. The cipher on the brass was still there. He ran a thumb over it and felt grit in the metal rim. He had not reclaimed innocence entirely, but he had turned what had been used as a tool into evidence and a warning. He sealed the chest one final time and spoke a single line into the stone, dark reliquary. "Record this night as it was." Then he left the chapel and walked away into a town that would not be the same. The ledger waited under stone for anyone brave or careful enough to read what had been hidden and to act on it. The last paragraph closes on a concrete act. He sealed the chest, left the ledger with Jolan's watch, and walked toward the lane where Elise and the villagers worked to rebuild a simple, ordered day.